Hi everyone, thanks for joining our podcast series. This is Sahityan and Ganeshanathan who is joining with you today to talk about RTI. RTI is Right for Information, and there's a lot of things to unpack here. And we'll be also talking more about RTI, the process, and we have a great person right next to us who will be talking on that. And me, I'm going to be the question master. I'm going to one who is going to curiously ask questions and also be a bit of amplifier of you all, where I'm going to sit here and ask questions that you might think that I need to ask. So let's go into that and we'll go with the introduction as well. So hi, this is Benny, but Benny will be introducing himself and what he does in apart from his normal work.
Yes, I'm Benislas Dushan. I work as an attorney at law. I work at the intersection of law, technology, and human rights. So I basically go to courts on the confluence of these issues. So yeah, happy to be here, and especially to talk about such a powerful tool that we have. So
It's interesting that you mention it is as a powerful tool because many think whether it's a law, it's a policy, but it's interesting that you used a word called tool. And why do you say it's a tool?
So, tool is something grade 7 science, right? That makes a work easy. And right to information gives us information that helps us to exercise our democratic right easily. Sometimes we tend to see our responsibility of a citizen is only to vote, which is once in every 5 or 6 years, depending. In Sri Lanka, sometimes it's 13 years, given the situation of the provincial council elections. But then sometimes citizens may feel like it's limited. But this right to information, I deliberately call it a tool because if you know how to use it, you can become an active citizen. And promoting an active citizen who wants to promote transparency, who wants to keep the elected officials as well as the public servants accountable, and who wants to make sure that there is transparency. There's the spirit of information flow, or nobody can hide behind and say, no, you cannot ask us any questions. You have to answer, and this is a tool that enables that.
Okay. So interestingly, we are in an information age where there is so much overload of information that we receive. So I think even myself to everyone who is watching probably will also have that question: what is information? Like, why do we need the information, and why do you need actually a law that gives you the right to have information?
Right. I agree, right? And it's highly likely that some of these clips from this podcast might get slided away because of the information overload, right? There might be compelling more other videos and resource materials. But just coming back to your question about what is information, I don't want to give a definition of an information, but anything that you think in the public realm that is relevant for a citizen, right? For example, say in a public body, how decisions are being taken, what are the emails that are being sent, meeting minutes, opinions, right? Memos of the meeting, right? Budgets, expenditure reports, right? Agreements that are signed. Obviously, not everything, somebody is not going to be a party to everything. There are obviously going to be exceptions, but otherwise, anything that a public feels like reasonably we have a ground to know what's happening behind the scenes, one can ask those particular entities and receive them. So that's what's covered in this RTI. And what do we mean by right to information is every citizen, you asked a pertinent question earlier, is it a law or a policy? It's actually a law, and it's actually a fundamental right. When the 19th Amendment was passed in 2016, under Article 14A, RTI was given a right to information, given the status of a fundamental right, which is a crucial way in which a citizen exercises his or her sovereignty, right? So, in that regard, a citizen can lawfully ask any entities to receive what we call the information. So, it is not just a policy, it is a right that cannot be denied.
And I think that comes to another question on the law versus policy. And even though it doesn't really touch upon the areas we are talking, but I think it's a good point that you can also clarify the viewers what is law and what is policy, and what is the key difference that you can make.
So, policy and law, right? I'll try to simplify it. Law, when something becomes law, or when it becomes part of the statute books, as we call it, it is enforceable. It has a binding effect. What do we mean by binding effect? Say there's a law that gets passed tonight saying that even if you have to walk on the streets, you have to wear a helmet, right? President signs it, and in Sri Lanka, all different kinds of laws gets enacted, and some we call draconian laws for that instead. So if that happens, I won't be surprised. But if it is required, tomorrow, if somebody doesn't wear a helmet on a street, although it sounds like a funny example, then they can be considered as they are violating the law. So it has a binding effect. When there's a law, everybody is expected to follow the law. And in law, we call one thing, right? Like, you cannot say you didn't know. Every citizen is expected to know what the country, in their own country, right? That's one thing. Policy doesn't necessarily have a binding effect. I'll just give you one example. There is something called directive principles of state policy in the Constitution, right? That talks about how a state should conduct itself, right? And how it, as the name suggests, these are the directive principles, right? But they are not necessarily enforceable because they don't have the binding effect, as I call it. So that is the narrow difference between policy and policies. Sometimes policies are precursors to legislations that might come about, right? And sometimes when there are legislations, when there are bodies, it is through policies they implement different programs, they implement different measures. So that is, sometimes people use it interchangeably, but yeah.
I think from that what we can get is so law is something, it's binding, and it's also that we all should know about it, and then we also have to use it as a tool, because in this case it's right to information is as a tool. And I think, as you all remember, that I mentioned that it has been 10 years that we had RTI in Sri Lanka. So then what happened before that? Did we have such tools existed, and how did we get information before that?
Excellent question. We didn't have, right? And it has been a long, painful journey to get to 2016 when we finally got it enshrined in the fundamental rights chapter of the Constitution. And they say, like, there has been almost 2 to 3 decades of continuous advocacy, especially by the civil society, media groups, investigative groups, human rights groups, to have this right. Because when there is a lack of free flow of information, when there is no transparency, then we are effectively getting away from accountability. So until that point of time, a citizen have to struggle really hard to get information from a government body. Sometimes it can be like when they do not have a right, when they go and ask, people will say, why should I give it to you, right? Do you think you have a right to ask me? But now, since 2016, each citizen of Sri Lanka has the right to ask different government bodies, statutory bodies, local government authorities, even sometimes private authorities that gets government funding. And sometimes even in companies where government owns a stake, like almost more than 25% of the stake, people can ask questions. People can ask for answers. This is what we want. So, yeah.
Yeah. So that's to be clear that it is government and anything which associates with government.
We cannot oversimplify by saying anything that is associated with the government, but if there is a significant investment of the government in the particular body, then it is also covered under RTI. Because when we say there's a company, there's actually a company called X, but for the semantics, I'm saying X, right? Say the government owns 51% of the share, right? That particular stake that the government owns, it's public money. And we are paying that money as taxes. So we have a right to know what's happening to that money. How are the decisions made in the company? Is it in the interest of the taxpayer? So then because of that, those sort of companies also get absorbed into this RTI framework.
So in just as your opinion, and it has been 10 years, that's almost a decade that we had RTI. How do you see as RTI has been used?
I would say it has been a game changer, and there are few legislative developments that we can call paradigm shifts. And Sri Lanka has a history of having paradigm shifts for negative reasons, because we tend to enact very draconian repressive legislations that targets numerical minorities. But in a positive way, RTA has been a paradigm shift. And I am not too sure whether we had such breakthroughs ever since, right? Why? Because if we see the quality of citizenship, what it means to be a citizen, I would say has improved. Now, when the local government elections happen, now people know that they can simply send a letter or an email and say, hey, look, under RTI, I want to know what's happening. Why is this order not yet being given? Who is given the tender? What was the budget? We could have seen, right? Now, we have a government that promised the people that it would eradicate corruption or clean Sri Lanka, as they call it, right? But even then, because of the use of RTI, people were able to say, I'll give you one example. There was, I think it was a Clean Sri Lanka event that happened in Jaffna. Somebody RTI'd it and said, look, you're having a Clean Sri Lanka event. I hope I'm right about it. There was an event where the president attended, but the cost of it was more than 13 million rupees, which is paid by the taxpayer. So that sort of radical transparency it creates. That's one thing. Second thing is, so citizens feels empowered, right? Secondly, the quality of journalism has really improved, because the investigative journalists back then, getting an information from the government, unless you have sources who were daring to leak it to you, it was very difficult. But by law, they are required to give you. And the beauty of it is, if they deny it, there's always a remedy to go to the RTA Commission. And even if there's a bottleneck, you can go up to the court to say, look, my fundamental right of receiving this information is denied. I ought to receive this information. And then court will interpret the law and say whether it's a fair request or not, or whether they are exempted by any exceptions, right? And the third reason why I call it as a paradigm shift is it has created almost a cultural shift in many of these institutions and in many of the discussions within these institutions, that the things they discuss, the meeting minutes, are RTIable. So we better behave. We better keep the record straight. So that's why I call it a paradigm shift, because it has affected the culture within some of these public institutions. It has empowered the citizenry, and it has created that spirit of transparency even among the watchdogs, and it has made their work easier.
Yeah, we can simply say in a positive reinforcement way that it has helped a lot.
Certainly.
Yeah. So we spoke about a lot of things. in our conversation. Even though we wanted to avoid it, we have to use a lot of jargons and technical words because the RTI needs those kind of explanations as well. But since you have mentioned it as a tool, think I'm a young person and I have that tool with me. And of course, I don't know much about what's happening around my country or maybe a bigger issues that I need to fight for. But now I have the tool, but what can I do with that tool?
So, as I said earlier, right, there has been a culture where if somebody wanted information from a public officer or a public institution or any institution that is significantly affiliated to or carrying out a public function, there was this feeling like we are asking for a favor. Would you give us this information, right? Then the paradigm shift happened where people were given it as the highest form of right, which is a fundamental right. The Constitution has recognized it, which is the supreme law of the country, right? Yes. So how can a young person use it, right? And why should a young person care? And sometimes people don't feel, okay, I have RTI, where shall I send, how shall I use it, right? Sometimes naturally, there might be a need. For example, there is an event happening in your road, right? And there is and that particular event is causing significant inconvenience to the public who is living down the road, right? And you're really concerned about it. And now you want to know whether this particular person has officially taken permission, right? If so, how was it moved, right? Now, this particular young person can send an email, send a letter, deliver it even by hand, and say, and it doesn't have to be in any specific, there are forms and all, but you don't have to do it. You can simply ask list of questions and say, I want to know the answer to these questions. Who gave the, was there a request for permission? Who gave the permission? From what time to what time? Is there an amount paid to the particular local government or particular local authority of that area? So that at that stage, the young person now, he has a legal route as well as a right to know how the particular public authority has engaged in decision making process, right? That's one example. Say another young person attends an interview. He wants to be part of the public sector, right? He feels like, or he or she feels like, the particular person has performed very well, right? Then they get the result saying you are not selected. Now, this particular person has the right to send an RTI request saying, I want to know the marking sheet. I want to know how I was marked as well as how the other participants were marked or how other interviews were marked. And there are plenty of cases that challenges promotions or that in the way of fundamental rights where they were denied promotions, whether they have RTI'd those score sheets and produce it to the court saying, look, it wasn't possible before, but now it is possible. Similarly, when there arises the need that you need information, instead of asking for favors, as a right, now you can send a list of questions saying, I want answers for this. Of course, there are exceptions. One cannot go and ask very private details of an individual. One cannot ask for health records. One cannot ask anything that would be considered as impeding the national security. So there are, of course, going to be exceptions. But on a general level, a citizen has the right to know of anything that are consequential to his life that is being carried out by the public facing or public entities.
Okay, that's interesting. And as you said, it can be also just as an email also we can do it.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be physically. You have to go to office and you can do that as well. So that's also interesting, I think, for us to know. And how do you also see that? Think like I have done a RTI, and how long it will take, and how long I should wait for something to come back.
As per the RTI law, which was enacted to give life to the fundamental right that was given through 19th Amendment, the RTI Act of 2016, it says within 14 days you should be able to hear back from the information officer. Now every public authority is required to have an information officer who will be able to respond to this RTI request. So within 14 days, within 14 days, you should be able to hear back. But sometimes practically in Sri Lanka things take time. It might take a little bit more time than that. But law requires them to send you the information that you have asked, even if the particular information, the questions that you have asked or a person has asked are exceptions, or the public authority isn't required to give them. They need to send in writing saying these are maybe classified or privileged information and this cannot be disclosed. But they have to send a reply within 14 days.
And if we had follow-ups, we can still ask, and they will still give more information.
Yeah, I would always say, of course, you can always ask again. And if they deny it, then there is other legal routes that is enabled by the law. You can go to the RTI Commission, appeal the particular decision to the RTI Commission. And even if you're still not satisfied with the decision of the RTI Commission, then you can move up to the courts.
Okay. So there is RTI Commission.
Yes.
Yeah. And what is the role of RTI Commission?
So RTI Commission is an independent commission, one more time. That is, and its primary role is to, when there are any conflicts regarding RTI, when public officers deny issuing information that was required them to issue, and any aggrieved party can go to this commission. That is one of the important duties of the commission, and say and air their grievances, and there'll be due process that'll be followed by a decision. And also RTI Commission will, like any other independent commissions, will do other active roles to promote right to information across Sri Lanka, and as any other commission will do other functions as well.
Okay. And so when you think about RTI, it's also about, as you said, where we have that access to information, we also have the right, and we can also ask for it. But there is also a limit of how much you can ask. And you already touched upon a point where there are a few things we cannot ask. But how do we have that line? Like, is the line is drawn by us? We should know, or is it something we can ask and they will let us know?
Excellent question, right? My thing is, sometimes certain things are common sense, right? Like, for example, you can ask how many days an officer has attended work because he's being paid by the taxpayer money, right? But at the same time, in case if he has traveled, you cannot necessarily ask what are the different places that he has traveled, because it's his private privileged information, right? But for any beginners, I would say, if you're confused, just ask. And if they can't reveal, they'll say they can't reveal. And there are obvious exceptions that are given by the law, right? For example, anything concerning national security will not be available. Or things like privileged information, right? Like health records. It doesn't need to reach the public eye. It won't be available. But now, there is an interesting juncture where we are at, where some of the agreements that are signed between governments, in my view, should be RTIable, because this agreement is going to affect me, right? But when the appeal was gone, they said, no, this is supposed to be confidential, we can't reveal it. Recently, I'll give you one more example that I thought that requires that requires a legal challenge where the meeting minutes of the Constitutional Council, there's a question whether it can be RTI'd or cannot be RTI. And when there was an RTI filed by another lawyer, the Constitutional Council or Parliament has responded saying no. But I believe it should never be an exception. What is a Constitutional Council? The natural question, right? This is the body where there are legislators, but also civil society representatives, where it is created in the spirit of creating checks and balances to an executive president, right? In 18th Amendment, 20th Amendment, during those times, president was given enormous amounts of powers. Even now, a president is given enormous amounts of powers. And he can unilaterally appoint anybody. What does the Constitutional Council do? A president now recommends who will be appointed to these consequential positions. For example, to the Supreme Court, right? Who will be appointed to the RTI Commission itself? Who will be appointed to Office for Reparations, right? Who will be appointed to Online Safety Commission, right? Wherever the law requires president to appoint them, now the president is going to send these names to the Constitutional Council. And the Constitutional Council is going to take a vote. And they'll say whether this particular, and whether you can appoint the person or you cannot appoint the person, right? And we've seen this dynamic playing out. So the spirit of this Constitutional Council is to create that transparent and accountable decision-making process. And as a concerned citizen, I feel like what is discussed in those meetings and how each Constitutional Council members have voted should be available to the public. So the larger point, if I could step back, although it is 10 years since RTA was brought in as a fundamental right, and the RTA law was brought in, through practice, through these different challenges, the law is also evolving. Now we are testing the limits of this law. What is supposed to be information? What is supposed to be privilege, right? And it also, these conflicts give interesting, these conflicts are also opportunities for us to discuss and debate what's supposed to be in the public realm and not. So I see these as opportunities. And these are some of the examples how RTI has evolved over time.
Okay. And, every right comes with a responsibility. So now we have the right, we have the tool, we can also demand on these things. But what do you think as for young person or any citizen should have the responsibility of using RTI?
I think as much as RTI is a right to information is a right, every citizen or a young person has also the responsibility to obtain information. And now they have a legal avenue that we have long fought for, right? Because now we see the issue is the information disorder, right? There is absolutely so many different narratives about one event. There could have been one reality, but there are 50 interpretations, 50 different realities that are being spread around. Where the responsibility kicks in is now a young person or any citizen could go to these offices and ask what has really happened. How much money was spent on this? What was the decision? Who voted for this? Who voted against this? Why is it a responsibility? Because in a democratic system, it is not only important to vote, it's important to make an informed choice. How do we make an informed choice? By getting the legitimate information. How do we get the legitimate information? Through using these tools such as RTI, where we are given the legal avenue to go and ask them, to demand. And when it is not provided, there are recourses that are being given. You can go to the commission, you can go to the courts, so that it has become an undeniable responsibility for anybody. If they really want to say anything in public, now they can back it up with facts rather than just opining.
So that means you can be informed citizens, that you can actively take part in the decision making processes that involves you, involves your community, as well as your country as well.
Because I think we speak so much about active citizenship, but I think very understated, but one of the most consequential aspect of citizenship is being an informed citizen, or the informed citizenship, which we do not see often. And it is understandable why. And right at the beginning, we spoke about information overload. We just spoke about information disorder. And now it's more than ever, it is imperative that we become informed citizens. And we use these tools to become so.
So, of course, as you said, there are different meetings. People want to use their free speech. Of course, if that can be documented and that can be used against them, then they might feel their freedom of speech is restrained. So, how do you think the both freedom of speech and RTI can work together?
Very interesting questions, right? Both of these are recognized fundamental rights, right? I don't think both of them are in confrontation to each other or in conflict with each other. What is freedom of expression and freedom of speech, right? It is the ability for one to express their thought, even at the cost that it might offend someone. And sometimes some people define freedom of expression or speech as, in some instances, it can be offensive speech. Not everybody will agree with you, right? But so the spirit of freedom of expression or freedom of speech is the ability for one person to articulate themselves or to express themselves without any external restraints. Of course, there are going to be some limitations. One cannot incite violence or engage in hate speech. But what is the spirit of RTI is, it gives a citizen the ability to know the information that he or she requires from a setup, like from a public facing institution, right? Just because somebody asks information does not mean it violates somebody's free speech. How do I mean by that? Like sometimes there can be, of course, meetings that takes place with Chatham House rules, where the discussions will remain within the participants themselves. For example, when somebody files a right to information request asking for cabinet decisions, right? If there was a decision, then most likely it's RTIable. But if there was a discussion and the decision wasn't reached, then it can very well fall into an exception, because it is still very much a decision. So I don't think we need to think just because the citizens are now asking questions, it prevent anybody from speaking their mind. I would argue people should speak their mind in public interest. Most of the times when it becomes a problem is when they speak their minds because of vested interests. Then they don't want what they have spoken to be in the public realm. And the interesting thing this question has brought out is, this is also the reason why the public officials or sometimes public bodies are hesitant to give information, is because then the people might get to know. right? So I don't think RTI by any way challenges the freedom of expression. If at all, it enables responsible, it vests more responsibility towards those who should be responsible. I'll give you a very simple example, right? Say there's a kid in a house. The kid is free to do whatever they want. They'll draw on the floor, on the this thing, put things, break things, do everything. But when the particular child knows that the dad or mom is watching, then it's most likely the child will behave, because on a psychological level, somebody is watching, right? Same in the offices, right? Say there are no, like, there's no CCTV or anything, they can do whatever they want, but then there's a CCTV in the office space, and sometimes people are like, oh, my boss might be watching, that's there, right? RT is very similar for any public official. So the public bodies as described in this law, or anybody who does public duty on behalf um, of the government, then it creates that, not necessarily fear, that sense of responsibility that their actions are privy to the eyes of the public. So let's better behave, because somebody might be watching. Somebody might RTI the minutes of this particular meeting. Somebody might want to know who proposed this idea. Somebody might want to know who awarded this tender. So it creates that responsible culture.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that's a question I think many would have. So I think you have clearly explained it, how to articulate that better. I also want to know that, like, we have been using it for 10 years, and of course there might be a lot of other countries has been using this for a long time. Anything on the global perspective of RTI and how it has been used?
Yeah. Why I said it's a consequential tool is, as per the recent UNESCO finding, almost 139 UN member states have RTI in the legal framework. Some might have it as a fundamental right, some might have it as a legislation, but it is there. And on a global level, there's this call for transparency, accountability, rooting out corruption, responsible decision making, and especially in the age of social media, right, where each and every citizen is given a voice. RTI has become inevitable need of the hour, because people, whether we like it or not, will demand for that information when they want it. We have been seeing this happening, right, all around the world. When the governments have been irresponsible, or when the public perceive the government as corrupt, although they might have voted for them in overwhelming numbers, they are not scared to throw them out. This happened in 2022 in Sri Lanka. So that is why we are seeing more and more countries opting into this legal regime. And it's almost like a, when you go to a school, right? Say you're part of this, when you go to a school assembly, there is an expectation for each school, each of those schooling children to behave in a certain way, right? And in an international multilateral setup like in the United Nations, when countries have these laws that ensure transparency, that gears toward rooting out corruption, that promotes the culture of accountability, it is almost like a those, each of those states are like well-behaved students in a multilateral forum. So that is why there's a wider adoption that's happening. Of course, Sri Lanka from 1994 pledge to 2016, it took a long road, but it was still worth it.
So we had RTI for 10 years, and and we just got to know also there are other countries who have been practicing different versions of RTI for a long time. So any law, I feel like it should not be just stagnated, right? It needs to have a different face to it, and also about the current challenges and the AI and all the information that we are getting. How do you see the next version or a 2.0 version of RTI looks like?
Unless there's going to be a radical amendment of the law, I think it's difficult to say it's going to be 2.0 version of RTI, right? But how I see the limits of RTI being tested is through multiple litigations and legal challenges. As I spoke earlier, when certain public authorities say that we will not provide information, then I think, and when a person decides to go to the next step and appeal it to the commission and then go to the courts, I think the courts will really set the boundaries of or interpret the law in a way where the RTI would be applicable and where it won't, right? It is sometimes it is not discussed enough, but it is well understood, common sense, that those who are in power do not want to show their hands, or in other words, do not want to necessarily share information that might put them in a negative light, or that might be used against them, or that might make them vulnerable. And sometimes some of the things could be done in good faith, but for optics it might look wrong. And because of that risk, they might not be willing to divulge information. That is why, towards the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen, compared to the first 5 years, a whole host of legal challenges, going to courts to arbiter what's supposed to be the limitations, exceptions, whether something falls on the exception or not. So I think even more such legal challenges would really come to define the extent of the law and how and the jurisprudence that emanates from it will certainly shape the way RTI is practiced. So I think the next front will emerge through that.
So last, I want to ask one simple key takeaway that you want to give our audience.
Great question. I still believe RTI is one of the most powerful tools any citizens can use. Why? First, it's simple. Although it is natural to assume that it is a sophisticated process because it's part of constitution, it's part of law, it's really not. If somebody knows how to write, and if they know what they want to know, you can write it, send it, and you can get the information, right? So it is simple. We don't need to overcomplicate it. And I understand why people feel alien to it, assuming that it needs a lot of legal knowledge to do. So it really doesn't, right? That's one thing. Secondly, it really, I think once somebody uses that tool and they know how powerful it can be, and when the answers are provided, it's almost like a human instinct, right? Like when we feel heard, we feel more invested in the process. When we ask a question, when somebody listens to it and responds, we feel invested in the process. And RTI is that catalyst, or the democratic catalyst, that will really nurture the active citizenship or informed citizenship in a democracy. So that is the second thing. So if there is one takeaway, I would say, please use it. Please ask questions. It doesn't always have to be towards those who are at the high levels. It can be in your local authority. It can be in the divisional secretariat where you get the services from. It can be in your own locality. The consequential decisions of public officials that affect you, you have a right to know how some of these decisions are made, how your taxpayer money is spent, who received the benefit, who did not. And it creates that spirit of transparency when you use it.
So thank you so much for articulating that very well. And I think it's also important for us to know that any tool which we cannot use it or which we are restrained from using it, it's just going to be there. So it's all about using it, trying to understand it, trying to play around with it, and try to figure out what is working and what is not working. And I think that's the fundamental rule of any tools that we humans have ever seen. So thank you for that. And I think today we discussed a lot of information, especially on RTI, how RTI came into the visibility, and understanding the different segments and certain limitations of RTI, and certain gaps that what we see. But we also spoke more about reaching that and how it helps some person to get empowered and getting into active citizenship and becoming more informed citizens as well. There's a lot of things that was covered, and there's future series which will be more covering on the process and also understanding about the legal aspect of it, and also we'll be also talking more about the social and economic impact of that as well. So that's coming on the way, and you can again meet us in the second series. And yeah, thank you so much for joining this series.
Thank you, Shaggy. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.